So the first one is, in terms of what I've taken away from my work in reconciliation or working in post-conflict settings, the first one is to look at African societies for what and how they are, and not what we think they ought to be. So if you're a scholar, not what the theories and the conceptual frameworks tell you that African societies ought to be, and not what the policies that we adopt wholesale from, both Chantal and Jumoke have spoken about, the role of colonialism and our colonial past. So not what the colonial idea has been about what our societies should be like. And also to look at what resources exist in a situation and how they work. The second set of points is around the role of terms, terminology, and language. And then the final thing I'll talk about is some of these solutions and some of what I've seen. In terms of looking at our societies for what they are and not what they ought to be, one of the things I've taken away or observed is that African societies are by nature entities that seek to live harmoniously or with some semblance of balance. So like you said, right now may not be the time to start talking about reconciliation, but there is the sense that our societies are ones where we are constantly trying to look for how we coexist with our neighbors, etc. So we exist in ecosystems where there are numerous moving parts, and both my fellow panelists have spoken about this. And there are established understandings of how these parts work together, whether this is positive or negative, right? So we have notions of Utu or Ubuntu, right? I am because you are. And this is expressed by our societies all across the continent, especially even in situations where people are experiencing conflict or crisis or rupture. And even where people are not, and I've experienced this as well, where people will relate to me when I enter into a space, because they may not be excited about what I'm doing if I'm coming to document violations, for instance, but there is an affinity established because I'm an African, and maybe because I'm a woman, and they acknowledge, and I'm acknowledging their Africanness and their humanity, and I empathize in one way or another with their situation, right? And then also that when these societies or these ecosystems don't work harmoniously, we do have methods and ways of establishing balance. So even like you say, it may not be the time now to start talking about reconciliation, but it may be time to think about it, right? So what are the ways in the context to begin thinking about re-establishing balance? I had an experience once. I was interviewing and collecting statements from women survivors of sexual violence and conflict in South Sudan, and one particular young mother, spoke to me. I went in there doing, asking questions, because this was a rights-based kind of documentation process, trying to find out, what her desire for justice and accountability was. And she simply said to me how immediately following her experience, what was most important to her was the ability to breastfeed her child. Now, after what she had physically gone through, the cultural kind of context did not allow for her to do that unless she had been through a particular process, right? And that included finding an elder in the community, finding a goat that could be slaughtered in order to perform some kind of practice so that it would restore her to being able to continue her role as a mother and the survival of her child. So the point here, and I'm saying this as a takeaway, is that when things don't work together harmoniously, our societies are continually trying to find ways to bring back that balance. And those are some of the things we need to be understanding. So what knowledge exists about how we can establish that balance? The second set of things that I wanted to talk about is the role of terms, of terminology, of language. So, whose terminology, whose language is it that we're using in trying to understand our context of crisis or conflict? Why do we accept it, right? So what is reconciliation? Whose reconciliation? What is a post-conflict setting? When did it become pre-conflict? Who decided it was conflictual or non-conflictual, etc.? What are we reconciling? What and whom? Why? How? On whose terms? if we're saying we're reconciling, what is it we're returning to, right? And what are we missing out? So then another question then becomes, what room for new and different and acknowledging the society or the world that we live in is there in these processes that we're calling reconciliation? How dynamic is it? How has the current situation shifted? And how has it been influenced and by whom? And I think Jumoke spoke about all these global processes that we need to take into account. So for example, many of you who are part of the Tigray Youth Network are diasporans. You're living in a country that is either not your own. Some of you may have been born in the country where you are. You may be very dislocated from this place that you call home. And even in as much as there may be affinity with those who are living there now, or those who have been affected or even displaced, there are also differences. Jumoke spoke about the intersectionality, right? The differences amongst not only women and girls, but just amongst people who may claim a particular identity. So it's important for us, even as we begin to think about what reconciliation may look like, to begin to think through terms, terminology, language, how we use it. Does reconciliation to you sitting in Europe or the United States mean the same thing as a Tigrayan sitting in a refugee settlement or even still within Ethiopia?